In the dark, chaotic waters off Guadalcanal in early August of 1942, the heavy cruiser USS Vincennes' young career was tragically cut short, along with the lives of many of her men, during one of the darkest nights in the history of the United States Navy. Her keel was laid down on January 2, 1934, at Bethlehem Shipbuilding Corporation's Fore River Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, and she was launched a little over 2 years later in May of 1936. Vincennes had an overall length of 588 feet, a beam of almost 62 feet, and a standard displacement of about 10,000 tons. She carried a main battery of 9 8-inch 55 caliber Mark 12 guns, which were housed in 3 triple turrets that were arranged in the classic USN 2-in-1 layout. Her anti-aircraft battery at the time of her commissioning consisted of 8 5-inch 25 caliber guns and 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns. Vincennes was protected by a 5-inch thick main armor belt, and her deck armor was just over 2 inches thick. Rated for 107,000 shaft horsepower, she was powered by 8 oil-fired boilers, which provided the steam for her 4-geared turbines. She had a top speed of 32 knots and a range of 9,000 nautical miles when cruising at 10 knots. At the time of her commissioning, she was manned by over 800 officers and enlisted men. Vincennes was commissioned into the United States Navy on February 24, 1937. In mid-April, she got underway for her shakedown cruise, which took her across the Atlantic, where she made port calls in Sweden, Finland, England, and France before returning to the States. Upon her return, Vincennes conducted training and maneuvers in the Western Atlantic until being dispatched to the Pacific in January of 1938. After an overhaul at the Mare Island Navy Yard in the early part of 1939, she shifted back to the East Coast and operated out of Norfolk for several months. In September, Vincennes began conducting neutrality patrols along the U.S. East Coast in response to German aggression and continued to do so into the spring of 1940. Near the end of May, she visited the Azores before proceeding to Casablanca, where she subsequently embarked a load of gold from the French Reserve for transport to the United States to prevent it from falling into German hands. After returning to the States in June, she resumed conducting neutrality patrols along the East Coast before heading for the Norfolk Navy Yard and an overhaul at the end of the year. Upon the completion of her overhaul and subsequent sea trials during the first week of January 1941, she got underway in the company of fellow heavy cruiser Wichita and the battleships New York and Texas for neutrality patrols and exercises in the Caribbean, which lasted until early March. Later in the month, Vincennes got underway for Brazil and then South Africa, where she took on gold to pay for weapons that had been purchased by the United Kingdom. After a brief yard period, she continued patrolling the Western Atlantic into the autumn of 1941. Vincennes was battling heavy seas in the South Atlantic while escorting a convoy to South Africa when she received news of the attack on Pearl Harbor. She arrived in Cape Town 2 days later on the 9th, and by January 8th was back stateside and entering the Brooklyn Navy Yard for an overhaul. During this overhaul, she received 16 1.1-inch 75 caliber anti-aircraft guns that were arranged in 4 quadruple mounts and 12 single-mounted 20mm Oerlikon autocannons to beef up her AA battery. In late January, Vincennes joined the screen of the new aircraft carrier Hornet as she conducted her shakedown training off the East Coast. She remained a part of Hornet's screen throughout February and departed with the carrier on March 4th for the Pacific Theater. On April 2, 1942, Vincennes departed San Francisco with Task Force 18, which was built around Hornet. Tied down to Hornet's flight deck were 16 Army Air Force B-25 Mitchell bombers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle. 11 days later, Task Force 18 rendezvoused with Task Force 16, which was built around the carrier Enterprise. Together, the two carriers and their escorts plowed westward toward Japanese waters, where on April 18th, Hornet launched the bombers to attack military and industrial targets throughout the Japanese home islands. Afterwards, the task forces retired eastward and stood into Pearl Harbor on April 25th. Vincennes and Hornet departed Pearl Harbor 5 days later with the intentions of helping the carriers Lexington and Yorktown thwart Japanese efforts to seize Port Moresby. However, after arriving too late to participate in the Battle of the Coral Sea, they executed a feint, along with Enterprise, towards the islands of Nauru and Banaba. This action caused the Japanese to cancel their operation to seize the two islands on May 15th. After briefly stopping at Pearl Harbor for fuel and provisions, Vincennes got underway again with Task Force 16 on the 28th. For the next week, they plowed the waters northeast of Midway Atoll, waiting for the anticipated advance of Japan's first air fleet on the U.S. base at Midway. Just after 5:30 a.m. on the morning of June 4th, 1942, the Japanese were sighted approximately 200 miles to the northwest of Midway by a search plane from the atoll. Hornet and Enterprise turned into the wind about an hour and a half later to launch their first strikes of the day. While Hornet's air crews, minus the courageous flyers of Torpedo Squadron 8, failed to locate the enemy in what has been dubbed as the flight to nowhere, Enterprise and Yorktowns located the first air fleet, and within a matter of minutes, left 3 of their carriers burning from bow to stern. However, as the U.S. planes returned to their respective carriers, several stragglers were followed by a hastily assembled strike that had been launched by Hiryu, the lone remaining operational Japanese carrier. Her planes then proceeded to attack the first U.S. carrier they encountered, which was Yorktown. Despite the wall of anti-aircraft fire that was put up to defend her, Yorktown was struck 3 times and found herself dead in the water by 12:30. Vincennes was dispatched in quick order to help defend the wounded flat top from any further attacks, and about 2 hours later, her men finally got their first taste of action when a group of Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers approached the stricken carrier from the north. Over the ensuing 6 minutes, her gunners demonstrated their abilities as they splashed one of the attackers and drove off several others. Despite the gallant efforts of Vincennes' gunnery department, as well as the rest of the task force, Yorktown was struck twice and slowed to a halt once more. She was abandoned in short order, and Vincennes spent the rest of the afternoon circling the wounded carrier as salvage and repair efforts were made in haste. The Battle of Midway was all but decided as dusk settled in on the 4th. Vincennes returned to Task Force 16, which then steamed to the east before changing course to the west during the early morning hours of June 5th. This movement, unbeknownst to the Americans, ended up preventing the force from being sighted by early morning Japanese scouts. Vincennes and her cohorts spent the rest of the 5th attempting to locate the Japanese, but to no avail. On the morning of the 6th, scout planes from Enterprise found a group of Japanese vessels that had been detached to bombard Midway, and several subsequent strikes sent the Mogami-class heavy cruiser Mikuma to the bottom and damaged her sister Mogami, as well as 2 destroyers. And with that, the Battle of Midway was in the books. Task Force 16 returned to Pearl Harbor on June 13th, and Vincennes promptly entered the Navy Yard for an overhaul which took her out of action for the next month. She was underway again on July 14th and joined Task Force 62 on July 27th as it was marshalling in the Fiji Islands for Operation Watchtower. On the 31st, her task group weighed anchor for Guadalcanal. The U.S. invasion force arrived in Savo Sound during the early morning hours of August 7, 1942. At 6:14 a.m., Vincennes' main and secondary batteries commenced firing on targets between Kukum and Coley Point on Guadalcanal. At 9 a.m., they shifted their fire to the main landing area near Lunga Point. After Marines of the 1st Division had made it ashore, Vincennes shifted to on-call fire support, but was not tasked with many opportunities, as the members of the small Japanese garrison on the island had either been killed or fled into the jungle before the Marines had landed that morning. That afternoon, Vincennes defended the transport and cargo ships in the Sound from several vicious Japanese air attacks by bombers from Rabaul. She was one of the first ships to open fire and brought down 2 of the attackers, while forcing several others to abort their runs. That evening, Vincennes, along with her sisters Quincy and Astoria, patrolled the western end of the Sound. At daybreak, she returned to her station off Lunga Point to once again cover the landing force. Around noon, 27 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers began a low-level torpedo attack. Vincennes, stationed about 3,000 yards from the transports, opened up with every gun she had. She even made use of her 8-inch main battery guns, as the shell splashes created by them caused the low-flying bombers to fly into walls of water or forced them to drastically alter their approaches. The heavy cruiser splashed several of them using this tactic, and if that wasn't enough, Vincennes dodged a torpedo as well, which passed under her stern, and evaded a bomber which fell off her port quarter. As evening fell upon Savo Sound, Vincennes was directed to lead a patrol near the western approaches to the Sound. Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner, who was in overall tactical command of the amphibious force, had received reports earlier that day indicating that a Japanese surface force was on the move and possibly heading down through New Georgia Sound. But the reports were vague in the number and types of ships, and calculations by Turner's staff put them as being unable to reach the vicinity of Savo Sound until mid-morning at best, which would be at a time when U.S. aircraft would be able to pounce on them. Captain Frederick L. Reefcohl, the commanding officer of Vincennes and of the Northern Cruiser Force, as it was dubbed, subsequently fashioned his night orders to give his crew a break, as they had been at general quarters for the better part of almost 3 days. At about midnight, Reefcohl retired to his sea cabin after having been on the bridge continuously since 4:45 that morning. At about 1:45, the destroyer Patterson, which was steaming in the southern cruiser group patrolling the southwestern entrance to the Sound, used her signal lamps to send out a message warning of strange ships entering the Sound. Moments later, the Australian cruiser Canberra was struck by a barrage of Japanese shells and was soon on fire from bow to stern. Moments later, the heavy cruiser Chicago had a torpedo rip through her bow. Men aboard Vincennes saw the star shells and gun flashes of the southern force being decimated and were bewildered as to what the source of those pyrotechnics was. They found out soon enough, though, when searchlights fixed on their formation and a salvo landed just short of their ship. The cruiser quickly came to life as her klaxon rang out and her men raced for their battle stations. Unfortunately, Japanese gunners were already several paces ahead of them. As the Japanese column had turned north, it had entered a rain squall. By the time it had emerged from the storm, the cruisers Furutaka, Tenryu, and Yubari were steaming in a single file line to the west of their force and the Americans. The Japanese now had the northern cruiser group caught in their crossfire and could see their every burning move. Astoria was the first to answer back, and just as Vincennes began sending 8-inch payloads out into the night, she was bracketed by another salvo. The next one slammed into her superstructure. Captain Reefcohl raced back to the bridge, and for the first few minutes there, believed wholeheartedly that he was in the middle of a friendly fire incident, even going so far as to issue a ceasefire command. But after the second salvo found its mark, striking the heavy cruiser's amidships aircraft hangar, Reefcohl came to his senses and ordered a hard turn to port in order to give his entire main battery a shot at the enemy. They promptly obliged him by striking the heavy cruiser Kinugasa twice. The hit to her hangar had set her planes, along with their ordnance and fuel, on fire, a fire that very soon became uncontrollable. Another hit knocked her aft gun director overboard. Just before 2, Vincennes heeled hard to starboard in an attempt to evade the Japanese gunfire, but before she could, she was struck on her forward port side by a torpedo. At 2:03, Another torpedo struck Vincennes on her port side, this time in the vicinity of her #1 fire room. Reef Coal, still wondering if he was under friendly fire, ordered a different set of colors hoisted, which actually confused the Japanese into thinking they were pummeling one of their own ships, and for the next several minutes they ceased shooting at her. However, they soon realized all of their ships were accounted for and resumed hammering away at Vincennes. By 2:25, the Japanese had vanished into the darkness, and the Battle of Savo Island was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Vincennes had managed to fire just 2 9-gun salvos and 2 6-gun salvos, while being struck by somewhere north of 58-inch and 5-inch shells during the fight. By 2:30, Vincennes' list to port had increased dramatically, and Captain Reef Coal gave the order to abandon ship. 10 minutes later, Reef Coal went down to the main deck and joined the last of his men as they jumped into the oily, debris-filled waters of Savo Sound. Vincennes capsized and sank about 20 minutes later, a little less than an hour after she had opened fire on the Japanese. 322 brave souls went down with her. The rest of her men were picked from the water throughout the morning by various destroyers, minesweepers, and auxiliaries. The courage and sacrifice demonstrated by Vincennes and her crew during the Battle of Savo Island embodied the highest traditions of the United States Navy. She was awarded 2 battle stars for her World War II service, and a Cleveland-class light cruiser, CL-64, was renamed in her honor. In 2015, her wreck was discovered during a sonar mapping project of the shipwrecks in Savo Sound. She sits at a depth of over 3,000 feet, and signs of the savage battle that sent her there are still very much visible. She was revisited in mid-2025 by a team from the Ocean Exploration Trust, which surveyed and mapped her wreck site extensively by using advanced underwater robotic systems and devices. The dive on Vincennes was streamed worldwide, and I will leave a link in the description for anyone who would like to view it. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe.